Welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mac.
Hello. Welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mac. I am your host, Dr. Mac. We will continue our series today of Women in the Bible. We're going to move on into the book of Joshua, and we're going to take a short story and give you some interpretations and the implications thereof. We'll be talking about Achsah and Calab today. That's daughter and father. The Bible contains many small and sometimes unusual stories that readers often forget or just plain overlook. The characters in these stories are rarely featured in sermons or in scholarly papers. Few Bible studies are ever written about them, and yet the God of the Bible included them in Scripture for a reason. But that reason is we don't know. We don't always know or even ponder to guess. The story of Achsah, the daughter of Calab, is one such tale. In a few verses, we are told of the fulfillment of God's promise in the story. Within a story, we are given a glimpse of a father-daughter relationship and the genealogy of a tribe of Judah. We witness the establishment of geographical boundaries of ancient Israel. We are given a pattern or a model for prayer in an 1893 sermon by Charles Spurgeon, and a guiding tenet for the feminist writers who reinterpret scriptures. All of this leads to a legacy of social, political, cultural landscape of ancient Israel and a greater understanding of Achsah's story as a metaphor for the social transition that occurred in the book of Joshua. We've said very quickly that our biblical source today is going to be the book of Joshua. We're going to begin in chapter 14, and we'll look at verses 14. We're going to look at chapter 15, verses 13 through 20. We'll look at the book of Judges, chapter 1, verses 1 through 15, and we'll look at the book of First Chronicles, chapter 2, verse 42. The book of Joshua is the sixth book of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, and it is the first book of the Deuteronomic history. It is the story of Israel from the conquest of Canaan to the Babylonian exile. It tells of the campaigns of the Israelites in central, southern, and northern Canaan, the destruction of their enemies, and the division of land among the 12 tribes, framed by two set pieces of speeches, the first by God commanding the conquest of the land, and at the end, the second by Joshua, warning of the need for faithful observance of the law of the Torah revealed to Moses. Well, what does Joshua mean in the Bible? Well, the book's primary figure gives its name to the title. Joshua means Yahweh saves, which is an appropriate name for the man who led Israel under God's command to victorious conquest of the Promised Land. So why is it so important? Well, the book of Joshua records the culmination of Israel's journey to the Promised Land. Here we see God fulfill his promise to give the land of Canaan to Jacob's descendants. Joshua portrays the Lord as their general, the one who would lead his people in victorious battle if they would trust and obey. Joshua recounted a story of contradiction. God promised them the land, as is given in the scripture, but they did not do what they needed to do to fulfill their side of the bargain. The Israelites did not finish the job. The Canaanite peoples became a damaging influence on Israel as years went by, which we noted in the book of Numbers. In this book, we find accounts of faithfulness. We find the story of Rahab, the harlot, the Battle of Jericho, and Caleb, the warrior, who is our main figure today. We also witness disobedience and its consequences. We get Achan, sin, and the resulting loss of A. We get the failure of the tribes to annihilate the enemy as God commanded. And even Joshua makes a treaty with the Gibeonites without first seeking the Lord. And that last one is found in Joshua 9th chapter, verses 1 through 27. As we said earlier, the title of the book is Joshua, and Joshua is the primary figure in the title. Therefore, scholars believe that Joshua himself, or a scribe under his direction, penned most of the book. Early chapters include first-hand experiences because we find the pronouns of we and us, as in Joshua 5th chapter, 1st verse, or Joshua 5th chapter, 6th verse, for example. And the military details really are being known and recorded by a general, as in Joshua 24, verse 26, which refers to Joshua's writing a portion of the book himself. After Joshua's death, the high priest Eleazar, or Phinehas, may have supplemented some materials in this book that alludes to events after the conquest of Joshua, starting in the 15th chapter, 13th through 19th verse. Now, what is the structure of Joshua? We always like to do that. It contains mostly narrative, but there is some poetry and discourse woven throughout the book. It's divided into three parts. Chapters 1 through 5 show Israel preparing to enter the land. Chapters 6 through 12 contain stories of a battle or battles. And chapters 13 through 24 establish the tribal boundaries as well as Joshua's encouragement to the faithfulness of God. We also find within the book of Joshua some of the ancient traditions that are preserved, but they are colored in many instances by the historian's personal point of view. Now, what are the themes? These themes are found in passages in Joshua, which can be recognized as theological interpretations. And they are major themes: the land, the leadership, the law, and the Lord. It's really neat. I always think of them as four: the land, the leadership, the law, and God. Now, there are some sub-themes that underwrite these four major themes. First one, God fulfills his promise. We've said that. The word promise appears 14 times in the book of Joshua, and for good reason. God promised the land of Canaan to the Israelites, and the book of Joshua is all about God making good on his promise. Second thing, disobedience leads to disaster. We see it clearly in Joshua 7th chapter where Achan sinned, and its theme that occurs several times throughout the book. When the Israelites obey God, good things happen, but disobedience leads to disaster. Several times the Israelites take a misstep and pay the penalty for that. Theme 3, true faith requires action. Joshua believed in God, and we see that faith by what Joshua actually did. In terms of action speaks much louder than words. Joshua stepped foot into the Jordan River at flood stage. That's in Joshua 3. He marched around the walls of Jericho for 7 days by faith, Joshua 6. And he even walked onto the battlefield where his opponents outnumbered him Joshua 11. So true faith requires action. Thing 4. We must take possession of what God has promised. Now, this is a timeless truth that many of us miss today. Just because God had promised the land of Canaan to the Israelites, that didn't mean that they wouldn't have to work for some of it. They would have to be involved in acquiring it. They had to take possession of what God had promised, just as we today must take possession of the victory God has already promised us. Theme 5. God is the sovereign judge over all nations. Clearly, in the book of Joshua, this is shown in a brutally stark reminder that God is ultimately judge of all nations. God leveraged Israelites as his instrument of judgment on the nations of that land for their sins, just as hundreds of years later, God would leverage the Babylonians to pass judgment on the nation of Judah for its sin. God is the sovereign judge over all nations. Theme 6. Holiness. We've had it before. Holiness fuels the miraculous. Before the Israelites crossed the Jordan, they consecrated themselves. Before the Israelites took Jericho, they circumcised the men. Before they defeated Ai, they cleansed the sin from their camp. Holiness fuels the miraculous. And last but not least, leadership matters. Theme 7. God used a human, Joshua, to lead the Israelites. As long as Joshua led well, the people were victorious. When Joshua fell, as with the deception of Gibeon, the people suffered. Nothing has changed in the millennia of human history. Leadership matters. But what's the big idea in the book of Joshua? Well, the book itself was written to the descendants of those who conquered the land as a historical account of how they had come to settle there. It celebrates God as general, defender, and king. It shows the geographical boundaries given each tribe of Israel. Even more significantly, the book of Joshua serves as the connecting narrative between the days of Moses and the days of the judges, during which the book was first circulated. That which Moses began and endured in the wilderness, Joshua was able to claim victoriously in the land. God's promises through the ages were being fulfilled before the people's eyes. Not one of the group promises, not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Joshua 21st chapter, 45th verse. The characters in this particular book, or in this particular segment of the book that we will discuss, are God, and we'll see that he's a different type of God here. Joshua, Calab, Achsah, Othniel. The book of Joshua takes forward Deuteronomy's theme of Israel as a single people, worshiping Yahweh in the land that God had given them. Yahweh, as the main character in this book, takes the initiative in conquering the land. Yahweh's power wins the battle. Well, Joshua definitely is the main character in the story. He is the one that we will read about. The Israelites are no longer a group of people walking places. They are settled on the banks of the Jordan, getting ready to enter the promised land. And we read about most of this in Exodus and Deuteronomy, but he is no longer the sidekick of Moses. He first appeared in with Moses, and now he is the main character of his own book. He shows up back in Exodus as Moses' apprentice. We learn of his existence in Exodus when the Israelites faced the Amalekites. Joshua even gets to go a part of Mount Sinai when the whole Ten Commandment thing was going down. Now, in Numbers 16, in the book of Numbers 16, chapter um, verses 13 through 32, Joshua is one of the 12 spies sent into Canaan to scout the land, and only he and Caleb claim they can take the promised land. And this becomes important when we talk about the division of the land among the 12 tribes. And then Moses died, and Joshua steps up to take his place. We won't discuss it today, but there was a little dispute about why not one of the sons of Aaron, or why not a son of Moses. Uh, but today we see that it is Joshua who takes the place of Moses. And Moses was immensely popular. He had done miraculous things with the help of God. And now Joshua has to come in and he has to step into those shoes and convince the people to go on to serve as an intercessor. So Joshua became the new Moses, quote unquote. Um, Moses, who was a prophet of God, who had some awesome powers. So after Moses, Joshua's job was to be all inspiring. So what are the marks of a good leader? Well, one has to invigorate, one has to accelerate, and one has to inspire. So Joshua knows what he has to do. So he makes amazing speeches, and one of his best is in chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. But he has to have some God given superpowers. So his first superpower act was bending the waters of the Jordan River, just like Moses did at the Red Sea. So, in many ways, he surpasses Moses in the things that he does with God's help. It isn't a rivalry of any sort, it's just that the people require something more. We find Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, and we find the people bursting out in songs, and we find them cheering them. And even when he was defeated at Ai, they couldn't break his stride because it really wasn't his fault that someone took something who was not supposed to. So God and Joshua, well, the way I look at it is that this was a mentor-mentee relationship. So God is the mentor, Joshua is the mentee. So Joshua's trouble and his struggle right now is to find the right way to lead his people and to keep his subjects safe while at the same time putting them in harm's way in order to fulfill what had to be done. Thus, we have a literary oxymoron. But on the flip side, God's job is to guide Joshua. He grants him courage, he grants him compassion, he grants him strength, and he lets Joshua know that wisdom and strategies are the keys to success. Because of this, the Israelites' conquests in the book of Joshua are totally successful. Now, I mentioned earlier God. Let's take a look at God. So we see, first of all, that, excuse me, God is a warrior God. So it sounds pretty different that Yahweh is a God that fights among his people, delivering them to victory and glory so long as they follow his rules. They were told this by Moses, they're being told this again by Joshua. And it sounds a lot like a football coach, right? So football players have to listen to their coach for guidance in the game. And the team, if the team wins, is his victory. If they lose, it's his defeat. If they follow the coach's play or rules, and if they do that, they are usually going to be successful. Let's break this down in terms of football. So God equals a coach, Joshua equals a quarterback, the Israelite army and is the rest of the team, the Israelite people are the bystanders or those sitting in the bleachers. Moving in the same vein, praying to God before the sporting event is not unusual. And this is something that the Israelites had to undertake before any of the battles. They had to pray. So the book of Joshua, although it focuses on war, it teaches us about one of the foundations of any religion, praying to a deity for guidance and for support. So our God becomes a knowledgeable God. He is the Father. He is the one who oversees. He is, in essence, the unbeatable warrior in the Bible. Now, we have some discrepancies in the family of Judah, and the reason we're going to take a few minutes and do this is because we need to talk about Caleb as well as Ashna. So, Caleb, there are two in the Bible, which is easy to do um, and confuse. And the problem is that both of them had a daughter named Ashma. But the Caleb that we're talking about, we've identified him earlier as being the son of Jonapel, and that is we can find that in First Chronicles, second chapter, the 42nd verse, and then we come down again in Judges, first chapter, 12 and 13 verses, and we know that the latter cable is the one we're talking about, who was the warrior, who was the leader. Now, and we're also going to find out that he was not an original Israelite. He is one, like many of the others we have talked about, who was adopted into the tribe. But he was one who followed Yahweh, who followed Joshua, who believed in what was being taught. He himself becomes a great leader. We have a number of passages in the book of Numbers wherein both Caleb and Joshua are highlighted, and he is identified as the son of Jonapel, who believed in God because God gave him perseverance, moral courage, faithfulness, and the zeal to conquer a portion of the land of Canaan. So God approved of him, and Caleb became one who was given and became the object of God's special favor. And he's adopted into the tribe of Judah, which is also a tribe selected by God to do special things. So as far as his genealogy goes, can get confusing, but we will know that he becomes a follower of Yahweh, which is all that we need to know at this point. Let's go back. And he adopts that name Kenzai too, which means he's an Edomite. So that gets into the genealogy also. And then in Joshua 15, chapter 13, verse, and Caleb, the son of Jonapel, he gave a portion among the children of Judah, according to the commandments of Jehovah to Joshua. That is Hebron. That is what Caleb had wanted, and that is what he received. And Joshua, in Joshua 14, chapter 14, verse, Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jonapel, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed Jehovah, the God of Israel. Thus, we are content with his genealogy, and we're content that he is the father of Achsah. Now, there's some vocabulary we need to take a very quick look at. Joshua carries out a systematic campaign against the civilians of Canaan. That's the men, the women, and the children that amounts to genocide. This practice was known as Hiram, as described in Deuteronomy 20th chapter 17 verse, which entail no treaties with the enemy, no mercy, and no intermarriage. Now that had been an issue earlier, but not now. It became the extermination of a nation that glorified Yahweh as a warrior and promotes Israel's claim to the land. Obedience is the second word. It is the opposite of disobedience, and it is a constant theme in the work. It ties in the Jordan crossing, the defeat of Jericho and Ai, the circumcision and the Passover, and the public display and the reading of the law. Disobedience appears in the story of Achan, who was stoned for violating the Hiram command, and for Joshua when the tribe built an altar on the Transjordan River. So Joshua's two final addresses challenges the Israelites of the future and the readers of this story to obey, which is the most important commandment of all, to worship Yahweh and no other gods. Joshua thus illustrates the central Deuteronomic message that obedience leads to success and disobedience to ruin. Now we have that in there, and the word inheritance is repeated 56 times, and that becomes part of what our topic is today, the inheritance of a daughter. And we know that in the scripture in the Old Testament, only the daughters of the man who died in the wilderness were given land by Moses. Here we have a birth daughter being given land as part of a diary. So where are we now? So what is the setting of the story? The events in the book of Joshua span about 25 years, starting soon after the death of Moses around 1406 BC, before the conquest commenced. The conquest of Canaan took about 7 years, and Joshua's final address and subsequent death came almost 20 years later. Now, the book begins with the nation of Israel poised on the banks of the Jordan River, as stated earlier, across from Jericho. It records the details of numerous military campaigns and defeats of the inhabitants of the land. And it ends with Joshua's regathering of the nation for his final exhortation. This history was written to the victorious Israelites who had settled in the land. This is important. They are no longer a wandering tribe in the wilderness. They had settled in the land. Though they were newly established as conquerors, Joshua reminded them that the conquest was incomplete. Very much of the land remained to be possessed. That's in Joshua 13, chapter, first verse. Our conflict, well, the land being one of those four major topics, it is the central topic of this particular section. It is recorded and recalled by those who remember Yahweh's message that they be given this land. But then God, Yahweh, withdrew it when they became those who didn't believe after the spies returned. Remember, 10 spies said, you can't defeat these people. 2 returned. That was Joshua and Caleb. The land is Joshua's to give, Yahweh's to give, or to withhold. And the fact that he had promised it to the Israelites gives Israel an inalienable right to take it. Now, the exilic and post-exilic theology wrestles with the word rest, which means Israel's unthreatened possession of the land, the achievement of which began with the conquest of Joshua. Before looking at the book of Joshua, we'll go back very quickly and do a quick review. So God chose Abraham to bring his blessings to the nation. Abraham's family grew and became the people of Israel, and after some time they were enslaved in Egypt. Now, through Moses, God rescued the Israelites and brought them out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, where he made a covenant with them. Then God brought the people through the wilderness to fight the hardships and the rebellion along the way. Finally, we have Israel camped outside the promised land. Moses is called upon to obey God's command so they could show the other nations the true character of the God they worship. So the book of Joshua picks up shortly after Moses died as Israel prepares to enter the land. The storyline of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua leads Israel into the promised land. That's Joshua chapters 1 through 5. And once they're there, they are met with hostility from the native Canaanites, and they engage in battle, Joshua 6 through 12. And their victories, Joshua divides up the land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, Joshua 13 through 22. And lastly, Joshua finally, the book concludes with Joshua delivering his final words to the people, Joshua 23 and 24. By the way, that last speech is a very beautiful speech, very much similar to that of Moses. So we get the allotment of the territory, and we're going to focus on the territory given to the tribe of Judah. And it's reflected in the prominence of the allotment, the amount of territory that they're given, the quantity of it. So we look at chapters 14 and 19, it's minutely detailed. And it brings in the tribes to come, which we'll see in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We'll look at David's emergence, and then we'll follow it all the way into Matthew 1 in the New Testament. And what's going to happen here is that Judah's tribal footprint in the land And Judah's claim to that land will for centuries be important, even after they return from their exile in Babylon. And then later history will confirm the importance of Judah's foothold in that land, for it constituted the remnants of the 12 tribes that enabled Israel to continue its mission in the world. We talk about the settling there and the boundaries that were established, and we won't go through what was on the northern boundary, the southern, the eastern, the western boundary, but we want to get to the summary statement here, which is right after the western boundary. And the west boundary was at the Great Sea, even its coastline. Now, in 12b of that scripture, we get this is the border around the sons of Judah according to their families. So it is a concluding statement, but what we have here, the important thing, that the border was at the sea, which offered a sense of security. It conveyed that the tribe had a well-defined border that surrounded them, protecting them, in a sense, from that which the outside should not have been able to invade. Then in 13 through 19, verse 13 to 19, Caleb gets the special allotment. We've already said he had Hebron, but he's also going to go for Debir and Nigir. So that distribution of the land to Caleb is given there because of the things that he had done. And those were basically the defeating of the giant who had possessed that land. Caleb had taken an army in there and he had defeated it. And the others who were terrified because of what had been told to them by the spies, that the Israelites would appear like grasshoppers. That's in Numbers chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. But that was not true, and there was punishment given them. So Caleb went back and he acquired the land. But there's one that that had been acquired and had been returned to the original owners, and that was Dubai. Translation: the city of books, the city of words. And here's a quote from there, because Caleb promises that any of the military men who can take that city again, um, he would give in marriage his daughter. Now, this is a dad. Did he have the right to do that? Yes, because the girls at that time were considered property of their fathers, and once they were wives, they were property of their husbands. So, in this case, Caleb had every legal right to give Eshna as a prize of war. Not as a captive, please, but as a prize of war. She's not going to be one of these women captives just as a prize. So it was Othniel who does this. Uh, and Othniel becomes the cousin. He's the younger brother, quote unquote, of Caleb. And one of the reasons we took a moment to go through his genealogy, because brother here, we're not sure whether it's blood brother or a different kind of brother, but it's brother. So Ashnel takes the initiative and she asks Othniel to ask Caleb for a field. And in the end, she's the one who asks Caleb for the field. And he says, sort of, no, your dad needs to do that, because as part of her marriage diary, she was given the semi-arid region to the south, which is Negev, which had no water. So we go back and we take a look at why that is important here. First, when she goes to visit him, we know that it's Caleb, who is the main actor in verse 17, and it is Caleb to whom she is speaking in verse 19. And thirdly, we take a look as she urged him to ask, and by doing that, we know again that's her father. That she had urged Othniel to do this, and he had not agreed to do it, suggested that she do that. In fact, the arrangement prohibited back in Leviticus 18 chapter verses 6 through 18. It actually prohibited Othniel from asking for more, because the land had been given, but there was something wrong with the land. The land was semi-arid. The land was without water. And in essence, it was having land and name only. There was no way to actually make a living or be productive out of it. And that becomes important a little bit later when we look at what um, Ushanel actually represents. So this first request is something that had to that had already been done. But I love the little message that happens here when she goes to see her father. He sees her approaching, according to some of the scholars. He sees this approach on a donkey, and that was the way of traveling. And many of the scholars are saying because she came on a donkey, that meant that she didn't live near him. She had to travel a ways to get to him. And he gets up and he meets her, and he basically says, "What do you wish? Sort of, what do you want?" And she does something that's really spectacular here. When she does that, she says to him, you know, in a very great. She first of all she gets down from the donkey, which puts her in a level of humility and respect for her dad. And when he asks, "What do you wish?" she doesn't hem haw about it. She simply tells him that you have given me the land, to the south, and now I need water. I need springs on the land so that it can be used. And there's no argument. There is no discussion. There are no more words in that very very short story. And he gives her the upper springs and the lower springs. And this is during like the first day of the wedding ceremony. Remember, their ceremonies were not like one day or a couple hours. They went on for a couple of days. But we had grumbling back to the distribution of the land among the different tribes as Joshua did this, and he threw lots to decide what the lands were going to be given. But back to Ashana, she gets the water, and as far as we know, even on over into the Book of Judges, that marriage holds up, and Ashana becomes even in his own right, as great as Caleb in a way. He becomes one of the first judges of Israel, and he brings peace for a long number of years. But Ashanel becomes the wife and a woman figure in the tribe. So we had that story going on, and as I said earlier, we would take a look at it as her being a symbol of prayer. I love that prayer. Now, her prayer is so simple. It says, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water. Give me a blessing." She didn't say, "Okay, you gave me the land, but it's no good because it has no water on it." There's one of the things, and Spurgeon talks about this in his 1893 sermon. There's a way to ask for the things that you really want. So the "give me a blessing" is a really nice way to do that. Even in 1893, he understood that, which is why it became a pattern of prayer. For those of us who are into the study of prayer, it became a pattern of prayer, which made it very important for us to study and made it important for us to know her story. As we go through this pattern and we're moving on to Sturgis, he says his whole premise is this: that if we read that story, we see how Asha went to her earthly father-daughter relations, went to her father and asked for what she wanted. That is what we are supposed to do. Throughout his interpretation of the scripture, we are to ask our heavenly Father in the same way that Ashanel asked her earthly father for her inheritance. There was no fear because she lived her life with him. By the way, most of the scholars believe that Caleb was like 85 at the time she was born, and her name means anklet. And she was described as a very beautiful girl, who caused men to look at her and think to themselves, "Wow, if only my wife were." But she marries a cousin, and as far as we know, and we do have feminists who have a different interpretation on that, that it was the way that it was that was a way that it was supposed to go. So, word or two more about Sturgeon and the prayer, the early prayer, and the pattern of prayer, the model of prayer that he offers. He refers to Ashna as a good woman. Before she went to her father to make her petition, she asked her husband for help. She asked her husband for help. But he, being a brave man, he had to be because he was a warrior. He was a warrior. But to go back and ask for more after Caleb had given her a dowry would have been more than what was to be done, and it was forbidden in Leviticus. So we learn a lesson there that good wives are to work with their husbands, to prompt their husbands, and to pray with their husbands, and to do it jointly, and to do things for the Father. The simple prayer is the blessing. Give me a blessing. And that blessing, she says specifically, she didn't ho hum about it. She says specifically, this is what I want. So when he sees her coming, he's glad to see her, and there's no, he gives it to her. Now, there are scholars who said perhaps he had never noticed, nor had Caleb noticed that there was no water there. But Othniel did notice there was no water there, and there would be no productivity without the water. So you pray as one who intends to have what you ask for. That is what you do when you do your prayer. First lesson out of that. Pray just as if you're going to get it. Now, secondly, in this story, Asach kindly notices her encouragement. She dismounted from her donkey. And when he said, "What do you want?" she says, she could ask anything for her father because she had been his only girl, by the way, by one of the wives that he had, and there were three brothers. So most of the scholars believe that she was in some way very spoiled, and she was used to asking and he was used to giving. But in this case, there is no dispute over it. And even if you have many petitions in your heart, none of them are going to be answered unless you ask for them. So uh, it's something that does us good whenever we ask, because the Lord knows that we have things, and then when He answers, we are grateful. When He doesn't answer, we understand that there may be a period of waiting for a reason, but God knows. God knows you know. And He gets pleasure in doing these things for giving us the things that we need, the things that will improve our relationship with Him, the things that will enrich our lives. Now comes her prayer itself. Just give me the blessing. Just give me the blessing. That's it. A father's blessing is an inheritance to a loving child. Simple as that. Give me a blessing. What is the blessings of God? Okay? Though near to death, like Lazarus, the dogs licking his wounds, Lazarus was blessed. So many of the characters in the Bible undergo that. So Achsah said to her father, "Give me a blessing." I wish that prayer might be prayed by everyone in that simple manner. Give me a blessing. Give me a simple blessing. We have to know what we want to ask, and we have to mix gratitude with all of our prayers. She expressed her appreciation for what she had been given. And she basically says that there's no water. It's not that I don't want what you have, but I sort of need water to make it work. So every blessing given contains the eggs of other blessings within it. You must take the blessing and find the hidden eggs and let them be hatched by your earnestness, and there shall be a whole brood of blessings springing out of a single blessing. And that's one way that Spurgeon puts it, and it's a beautiful way to put it. You know, you give me this land, I will be able to support my household. I'll be able to water my cattle. I'll be able to handle my fields. She didn't go into all that detail, but the simple request, and Caleb being a wise man, he was a wise man. Um, it just give me the springs of water, because the springs of water is a universal symbol for what? Life. I will be able to create and bring forth life and to support those who are dependent upon me. So now he gave her a large measure, and the large measure she asked for a spring. He gave her the upper spring, and he gave her the nether spring, which is also the lower spring. He gave her both. He gave her in abundance what she asked for. Now, did she know this was going to happen? We don't know. It's not said. It just says that he gave her a blessing. So this is why this short passage becomes, in many ways, a model or a pattern of prayer that goes there. So let's take a look at what Lauren Jacobs has to say. And this is years past the 1893. This is more contemporary, 2013 or so, where she talks about the Caleb and Achsah and their relationship. She focuses primarily on the father-daughter thing. Um, when he looked around, quote unquote, and looking, he's older now. He's actually ready to stop the fight. He wants to retire, but he has one more thing to do. He looked around and he saw his beloved daughter, who was his firstborn, and he knew he had to make some provisions for her. Now, there are those who said, and Jacobs doesn't say this, but he wanted to find someone very much like himself to leave in his daughter. He needed to make a marriage. Here we have a marriage contract. He needed to make a marriage contract. Now, this wasn't done like the normal ones. He did it in front of the troops, his men. He who takes the city of the bride, I will give my daughter in marriage. So you're going to say, oh, that's his cousin. Well, heck, we can't go in it today, but there's so many cousins who were married in the Old Testament. Um, but here again, we have a situation here. And did she obey or disobey her husband? No, she did for a daughter. She went to her father as as his daughter, one that she knew would usually give her what she needed and wanted. So he's glad to see her, and he says, "My child, why do you not come to me sooner?" That's not what he said, but she says, "I know, Papa, but I was hoping Othniel would come." That's paraphrasing in these terms, but he still gives her what she needs and what she asked for. So, as Caleb's daughter, as one who was recently married, as one who um, now becomes the property of her husband, um, it's not very romantic sounding. But in that particular time, it may have been. It may have been the things that need to be done. So, why is the story important? What does it tell us? It's a story, a lesson that many of us forget. It's a story about trusting God when the odds seem impossible. Boys were given the land. Male sons were given the land. This is an unusual situation. This is a situation where a girl was given land. There's no combat involved or anything. It was just a gift from her father on top of the dowry that she had already received. She was her dad's treasure. And for those who write and say that maybe she was simply just an object, a way for him to capture back what he had lost in the bride. And the bride, by the way, was the new name given it once Othniel captured it. I don't think so. It seems that he wanted to make sure that provisions were made for her, that things would be done. So it was an arranged marriage, something that's not done here in our Western culture, but it seemed to have been something that was important to be done there. So, as the anklet, what is the translation of Othniel's name, uh, it's the tie that brings both father to son and daughter to father. It builds that relationship. Um, it's possible that Othniel had already been looking at Asenath, um, but he won her in battle, and they had the property that they needed to have. Let's take a look at the last couple of facets of this piece. Remember, there are only a couple of verses in the short story, but it is important that we know it and we read it because the father wants a man who's going to be willing to take care of his daughter, a warrior per se, someone he wants to give a daughter who is spotless and pure to a husband who is going to be humble, submissive, but at the same time bold and confident. And this is something that Achsah could give to Othniel because she was the daughter of Caleb. She was his daughter, and she had many of his traits. She was the beloved, and I enjoy reading, she was the beloved daughter of Caleb. So let's take a quick, very look at the socio political, cultural landscape that one can get from here. In countries that are emerging, and this was written by a writer from the continent of, from India, and said the women are going through identity crisis. And for them, the story of Achsah means so much because of the way she conducted herself. She was much of what she underwent as a daughter. Many of them undergo now. The father decides on the arranged marriage, but they love this story, especially the way that it makes them feel because it gives them identity. Um, she accepted who she was, but she went ahead and she asked for what she needed. And she didn't ask in an aggressive manner, she asked in an assertive manner. She was respectful, we've said that before. She didn't feel that she would be going to be dominated or subjugated. The way she asked was in the following way. First, she understood as she proceeded that she would have to be assertive and affirming. She knew that. If she was going to conquer the land and settle in it, she understood that her identity had to be connected with the possession of the land. The land assumes the economic, political, as well as the symbolic importance of providing for a sense of identity and rootness in the society. In other words, here we have someone who owns land and therefore she is important. And we go to secondly, for the first time, she's claiming land, that she didn't conquer, but it was just being given to her through a request from someone who loved her. And then secondly, we have the fact that she becomes self affirming. She reverses the trend of being a non human. Um, uh, for being a non human and an object, she becomes a person. She becomes someone who who is loved and understands and has a good relationship with her dad. She's not just an object to be bought off. She becomes his daughter, someone who matters to him. The relationship then becomes a relationship of assertiveness and affirmation. And notice what happens here. She claims the blessing that she asked for. And she claims it as a gift, not as an obligation. She claims it as a gift. She's not looking at it as a birthright. It wasn't bestowed by her father on the firstborn son. It is a gift from her father to her upon her marriage. As we go on down, we see that she proves herself to be capable of owning the land. And then thirdly, she is not being done or handled in an abusive manner. She is being handled as a member of the community, which becomes really important to her, or becomes really important to every woman. Remember, we had back in the previous book, what the women and wives, what the roles and responsibilities were. So all's well that ends well in this particular story. Now, the last thing that we want to say, and I hope we don't run out of time, is that we have to accept that Ashna becomes a metaphor for the transition that occurred in the book of Joshua. I said earlier, the Israelites were no longer just moving through the wilderness looking for a place to go. No, they were not. They now had, especially when you look at the story, the bride price, the dowry, she had the land. And it was no longer going to be a camp, just an encampment. It was going to be a blessing in terms of um, settling, a settlement. She was going to become the wife, the mother, the leader of the household, a helpmate to her husband. That's what it was going to be for her. They were no longer going to live in groups, but they were more able than that to live in clans. But more importantly than that, they could live as families. You know, before you had this progressive stand, and it was done basically and many times for protection. But in this case, you get to see the social economic background, which is very important because they had in Israel, in ancient Israel, you had the tribe. Everything was done for the tribe. Then everything was done for the clan or the family, and then everything was done for the household. So this metaphor that we're talking about here is that it's a transition to the household. Astronaut has a chance to be a woman who runs a household, who is a mother to her children, husband to her wife, and not so much as doing everything for the tribe. I hope you have enjoyed today's discussion regarding Astronaut and Caleb. And I do hope you remember it's just a few verses, but oh, does it cover so very much? It covers so much. Her offsprings would be those that she would still have to honor the covenants that were made by Moses, as well as the explanations and the wonderful things that were done by Joshua. But think of this, as a head of a household, along with her husband, Chanel, Achsah had grown up in a period of wandering which would have consisted of not only her unnamed mother, we're never told that, or her brother, but also of her father's other wives, his concubines, and his sons. It's also possible that Caleb had another daughter who had other wives and sons. But this particular story focuses in on Achsah and Caleb and Ashnel, where she is given a chance. Her very life becomes a metaphor for having a household and for worshiping Yahweh as was asked of her to do. This is what was asked of her to do. And she would be able to teach this unto her children, and they in turn would teach it to their children. So she was able to set up a household in Negev because now she had a field with springs. That was not just a dowry, but was more importantly a gift from her husband. This new household would depend on the yield of the fields that were irrigated by the springs, and their livestock would be watered by that, and the land would give according to the seasons. It wasn't the tribe anymore that was going to be dictating. Um, it was called on times when there were problems, and we'll see that in the book of Judges. But the focus here is on the household. It was on the household. So there's a verbal repetition in this particular story of Caleb's daughter, this young woman, as Spurgeon called her, but it is interwoven with Caleb and Ashnel's life, which is as it should be. So we have gone from a time of wandering to conquest. We have gone from a time of conquest to settlement, and we have gone from a time of household, passing on the lessons. Although the book of Judges is going to tell us a totally different story. Please join me next week as we take a look at the book of Judges. And we're going to take a look at an unknown woman who does something for the whole tribe of Israel. Thank you for joining me and for sharing with you today. May God bless you. Thank you.